At 24, Aaliyah Hayes was too young to know the rules, and too brave to follow them. When she stepped into Judge Richard Langford's courtroom, she didn't just see a case, she saw a conspiracy. What started as a fight for one man's freedom turned into a war against a system rigged to destroy her. But Aaliyah had a secret weapon: the truth. And when the truth came out, it didn't just shock the courtroom, it shattered it. Judge Richard Langford wasn't just a judge, he was an institution. For 24 years, he had ruled the Wayne County Courthouse in Detroit with an iron fist. His courtroom wasn't a place of justice, it was a stage where he played God. Behind his polished oak bench and cold, calculating eyes, Langford had built a legacy of corruption. Prosecutors loved him, defense attorneys feared him, and if you were black, you knew the odds were already stacked against you before you even stepped into his courtroom. Langford's reputation was no secret. He had a pattern: overrule defense objections, sustain prosecution motions, and deliver guilty verdicts with a smirk that said, "I dare you to appeal." His rulings were rarely overturned, not because they were fair, but because he had friends in high places. To the people of Detroit, Langford wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Enter Aaliyah Hayes. At just 24 years old, she was the youngest attorney in the room, but her age was the only thing small about her. Aaliyah had graduated top of her class from Howard University School of Law, and she had a fire in her that no courtroom could extinguish. She wasn't just smart, she was fearless, and she had a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch, and winning. But Aaliyah wasn't here just for the win. She was here for justice. 5 years ago, her uncle, a hard-working mechanic, had been wrongfully convicted of embezzlement in Langford's courtroom. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses unreliable, but Langford had sealed his fate with a single slam of his gavel. Her uncle died in prison, a broken man. That day, Aaliyah made a promise. She would take down Langford no matter what it took. Today, she was one step closer to keeping that promise. Her client, Tyrone Wilkes, sat beside her, his hands cuffed and his shoulders slumped. Tyrone was 22, a college dropout trying to turn his life around, when he was accused of armed robbery. The evidence was laughable: a grainy surveillance video and a shaky eyewitness who couldn't even pick Tyrone out of a lineup. But none of that mattered. Not in Langford's courtroom. The prosecution, led by Philip Calloway, a smug, fresh-out-of-law school attorney, was already celebrating. Calloway had never lost a case in Langford's courtroom, and he wasn't about to start now. He leaned over to his co-counsel and whispered, "This'll be over by lunch." Aaliyah heard him. She didn't flinch. She had spent months preparing for this moment. She had studied Langford's every move, every ruling, every smirk. She knew his patterns, his weaknesses, his secrets. And she had a plan so bold, so risky, that even her mentor had warned her against it. But Aaliyah wasn't here to play it safe. She was here to win. As the bailiff called the court to order, Langford entered the room, his black robe flowing behind him like a shadow. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room with those cold, piercing eyes. When his gaze landed on Aaliyah, he paused, just for a second. But it was enough. Aaliyah met his stare, unflinching. For the first time in 24 years, Langford felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbled in their notepads, jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the gallery buzzed with whispers. Aaliyah Hayes sat at the defense table, her back straight, her eyes sharp. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and she wasn't about to let Langford intimidate her. The prosecution's opening statement was predictable. Philip Calloway, the young, overconfident attorney, painted Tyrone as a dangerous criminal who had terrorized a local convenience store. The evidence was weak: a grainy surveillance video and a shaky eyewitness. But Calloway delivered his lines with the confidence of a man who knew the judge was on his side. When it was Aaliyah's turn, she stood, her voice steady, but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you're about to hear is not just a case about a robbery. It's a case about truth, about justice, and about a system that has failed too many people for too long." Langford's eyes narrowed. He didn't like where this was going. As the trial progressed, Aaliyah raised objections, improper questioning, hearsay, leading the witness, but Langford dismissed every single one. His rulings were swift, his tone dismissive. Calloway smirked, clearly enjoying the advantage. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She kept her cool, her eyes scanning the jury. She noticed their discomfort, the way they shifted in their seats whenever Langford overruled her. They were starting to see the cracks in the system. And that was exactly what she wanted. The prosecution's key witness was a nervous store clerk named Mr. Thomas, who claimed to have seen Tyrone at the scene of the robbery. Calloway led him through his testimony, carefully guiding him to identify Tyrone as the perpetrator. When it was Aaliyah's turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness stand with a calm confidence. "Mr. Thomas," she began, "you testified that you saw the defendant at the scene of the crime. Can you describe what he was wearing?" Thomas hesitated. A black hoodie, I think." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "You think? Or you're sure?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure. A black hoodie." Aaliyah pulled up the surveillance video on the courtroom screen. "This is the footage from the store that night. Can you point out the defendant?" Thomas squinted at the screen, his finger hovering uncertainly. That's him. Right there." Aaliyah paused, letting the moment sink in. "Mr. Thomas, the man in the video is wearing a red jacket, not a black hoodie." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Calloway jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness." Langford didn't even look at Aaliyah. "Sustained." Aaliyah didn't back down. "Your Honor, the witness's testimony is clearly inconsistent. This is a matter of credibility." Langford's voice was icy. "Move on, Ms. Hayes." Aaliyah clenched her fists but kept her composure. She had made her point. The jury had seen the inconsistency, but Langford's bias was becoming impossible to ignore. Aaliyah had one last card to play. She stood, holding up a piece of paper. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce new evidence that proves my client's alibi. This is a time-stamped receipt from a gas station on the other side of town, showing that Tyrone was miles away from the scene of the crime at the time of the robbery." Calloway was on his feet before she could finish. "Objection. This evidence was not disclosed during discovery." Langford didn't even hesitate. "Sustained. The evidence is inadmissible." Aaliyah's voice rose, her frustration barely contained. "Your Honor, this is a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. The prosecution has a duty to disclose exculpatory evidence. By withholding this receipt, they've denied my client a fair trial." Langford's face turned red. "Ms. Hayes, one more word, and I'll hold you in contempt." The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Aaliyah stood her ground, her eyes locked on Langford's. "For the record, Your Honor, you are denying my client his constitutional right to a fair trial." Langford slammed his gavel. "That's enough. One more outburst and I'll have you removed." Aaliyah took her seat, her heart pounding. She had pushed Langford to his limit, and she knew it. But she also knew something else. The jury had seen everything. They had seen Langford's bias, Calloway's smugness, and the weakness of the prosecution's case. The game was far from over. The courtroom was tense as Aaliyah stood to deliver her closing argument. But this wasn't going to be a typical closing. She had something bigger planned, something that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This case isn't just about Tyrone Wilkes. It's about a system that has failed us. A system where justice is a privilege, not a right. And it's about one man who has abused his power for far too long." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she turned to face Judge Langford. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this trial has been a sham. From the moment we walked into this courtroom, you've made it clear that the deck was stacked against us. But what you didn't know is that I've been watching you. And what I found will shock this courtroom." Langford's face turned red. "Ms. Hayes, this is highly inappropriate. Sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt." Aaliyah didn't budge. "Your Honor, I have evidence of your corruption, bribes, biased rulings, obstruction of justice, and I'm prepared to present it to this court." The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. Langford slammed his gavel, but the noise only grew louder. Aaliyah pulled out a thick dossier from her briefcase and handed it to the bailiff. This dossier contains bank records, witness statements, and documented instances of Your Honor's misconduct. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Judge Richard Langford has been abusing his power for years. Langford's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. His face went pale. This is outrageous. Bailiff, remove Ms. Hayes from this courtroom immediately. But before the bailiff could move, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 federal agents in dark suits strode in, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice booming. Judge Richard Langford, you are under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, jurors stared in shock, and the gallery erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Langford stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. This is a mistake, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I demand to speak to my lawyer. The agents didn't respond. They moved swiftly, snapping handcuffs around Langford's wrists. As they led him away, the once powerful judge looked small, defeated. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the man who had ruled their lives for 24 years was reduced to a criminal in handcuffs. Aaliyah stood tall, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had taken down the most powerful judge in Detroit. But the fight wasn't over yet. With Langford gone, the courtroom was in disarray. The new judge, Judge Eleanor Carter, was quickly brought in to take over the proceedings. She was a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, and she wasted no time in addressing the chaos. "Order in the court!" she barked, slamming her gavel. The room fell silent. Judge Carter reviewed the evidence Aaliyah had presented, her expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, she looked up. Based on the evidence before me, it is clear that this trial has been compromised. The charges against Tyrone Wilkes are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned. The words hung in the air for a moment before the gallery erupted in cheers. Tyrone turned to Aaliyah, tears in his eyes. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Aaliyah smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Just go home and live your life. But as Tyrone walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, Aaliyah couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling in her chest. She had won, but she knew there were others who hadn't been so lucky. Langford's corruption had destroyed countless lives, and while his arrest was a victory, it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. The sun was setting over Detroit, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. Aaliyah Hayes stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, a cup of coffee in her hands. The events of the past few days played in her mind like a movie on repeat. Langford's arrest, Tyrone's freedom, the chaos in the courtroom, it all felt surreal. She took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. But it was a fragile peace, one that came with the weight of responsibility. She had taken down one corrupt judge, but she knew there were others like him. The system that allowed Langford to operate for so long was still intact, and it would take more than one victory to change it. Aaliyah thought about her uncle, the man who had inspired her to become a lawyer. He had died in prison, a victim of Langford's bias. She had promised herself that she would fight for people like him, and today, she had taken a step toward keeping that promise. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She pulled out her phone and opened a news article about Langford's arrest. The headline read, "Young attorney takes down corrupt judge. Aaliyah Hayes exposes decades of injustice." She scrolled through the comments, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. People were calling her a hero, a symbol of hope. But Aaliyah knew the truth. She was just one person in a long fight for justice. She made a silent vow to herself. No matter how powerful the opposition, no matter how broken the system, she would keep fighting. For her uncle, for Tyrone, for everyone who had been wronged by people like Langford. The media frenzy began almost immediately. Langford's arrest was front-page news, not just in Detroit, but across the country. News outlets ran headlines like, "Corruption Exposed," "Judge Langford's Downfall," and "Aaliyah Hayes, the lawyer who took on the system." Social media was flooded with posts praising Aaliyah and calling for reform. Talk shows invited legal experts to discuss the case, and pundits debated the implications of Langford's arrest. "This is a wake-up call," one commentator said. "If a judge as powerful as Langford can be brought down, what does that say about the rest of the system?" Aaliyah found herself at the center of it all. She gave interviews, attended press conferences, and even appeared on a popular late-night show. But amidst the attention, she never lost sight of why she was doing this. Every time she spoke, she made sure to highlight the bigger issue: the systemic corruption and racial bias that had allowed Langford to operate for so long. Her story resonated with people. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, from people who had been wronged by the justice system. They thanked her, shared their stories, and asked for her help. Aaliyah read every single one, her resolve growing stronger with each word. She became a symbol of hope, not just for those who had been directly affected by Langford's corruption, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. And with that hope came a new sense of responsibility. Aaliyah knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in her. Tyrone Wilkes stood outside his mother's house, his heart pounding. It had been months since he had seen her, months since he had been home. The last time he was here, he was a free man. Then came the arrest, the trial, the fear that he might never see this place again. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It swung open, and there she was, his mother, her eyes filled with tears. She pulled him into a tight hug, her sobs muffled against his chest. "My baby," she whispered. "You're home." Tyrone held her, his own tears streaming down his face. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. The scars of his ordeal were still fresh, the memories of the trial still haunting him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, Tyrone tried to adjust to his new reality. He spent time with his family, reconnected with old friends, and even started looking for a job. But something was different. The experience had changed him. He had seen firsthand how the system could destroy lives, and he knew he couldn't just go back to the way things were. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his mother, he made a decision. "I want to help people," he said. "People like me, who get caught up in this system and don't know how to fight back." His mother smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've always had a good heart, Tyrone. If anyone can make a difference, it's you." Tyrone didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to try. He reached out to local organizations that worked on criminal justice reform, offering to share his story and help in any way he could. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The trial of Judge Richard Langford was the biggest story in the country. News vans lined the streets outside the federal courthouse, and reporters jostled for a glimpse of the disgraced judge as he was led inside. For weeks, the nation watched as the case unfolded, each day bringing new revelations about Langford's corruption. Aaliyah Hayes was the star witness. She took the stand, her voice steady but filled with emotion, as she recounted the years of bias, bribes, and abuse of power she had uncovered. She presented the dossier of evidence, detailing Langford's crimes with precision and clarity. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Langford's defense team tried to discredit her, but it was no use. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, witness testimonies, and documented instances of misconduct painted a damning picture of a man who had betrayed the very system he was sworn to uphold. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Guilty on all counts. Langford's face went pale, his hands trembling as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once powerful judge was reduced to a broken man, his legacy of corruption finally exposed. As Langford was led away in handcuffs, Aaliyah felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, but also a deep sadness. She had won, but the victory came at a cost. The system that had allowed Langford to operate for so long was still broken, and she knew the fight was far from over. Aaliyah's victory made her a national icon. She was hailed as a hero, a symbol of hope for those who had been wronged by the justice system. Her story inspired a new generation of attorneys to fight for justice, no matter the odds. But Aaliyah didn't stop there. She knew that one victory wasn't enough. She wanted to create lasting change, to ensure that no one else would have to suffer the way her uncle or Tyrone had. So, she founded the Justice for All Initiative, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping those wrongfully convicted and advocating for criminal justice reform. The organization quickly gained traction, attracting donations and volunteers from across the country. Aaliyah worked tirelessly, using her platform to raise awareness and push for policy changes. She testified before Congress, wrote op-eds, and spoke at rallies, her voice a powerful force for change. But amidst the accolades and attention, Aaliyah never forgot why she had started this journey. She kept a photo of her uncle on her desk, a reminder of the promise she had made. And every time she helped someone get their freedom, she felt a little closer to fulfilling that promise. Aaliyah stood outside the courthouse, the gavel engraved with Judge Richard Langford resting in her hands. For 24 years, it had been a symbol of power, corruption, and injustice. But today, it was just a piece of wood. She raised it high, her heart pounding, and smashed it to the ground. The sound echoed through the empty street, a final blow to an era of lies. The screen faded to black, the words appearing in bold white letters. Justice is not a privilege, it's a right. Share this story if you believe in real justice.